She will be speaking about the case against Islamophobia. I think that's probably a slightly tongue-in-cheek title. And the appointment of Mohammad Al-Isa to deliver the Arafat khutbah. Yunus, can you, yeah, we're live and good to go? Okay, Asma, floor is yours.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد الصادق الوعد الأمين. Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Asma Alabed. Before I get started, I just want to thank the organizers of this conference. Jazakallah khairan. Inshallah, it's a source of benefit for everyone. And may Allah reward you for your efforts. I also want to disclaim that a lot of the thinking that went to this paper is actually owed to the people who are working to combat Islamophobia and working in the Islamophobia studies field. So this is in no way, shape, or form meant to diminish their contributions. Picky. The title of my paper is The Case Against Islamophobia, the appointment of Mohammad Al-Isa to deliver the Arafat khutbah. For those of you who don't know, last year Mohammad Al-Isa, who is dubbed the Zionist Imam, was appointed to give the khutbah or the Arafat sermon on one of the holiest days of the year for the Ummah, despite his cooperation with political figures oppressing the Ummah and anti-Islamic statements. This research will attempt to This research will attempt to problematize the usage of the term Islamophobia by elucidating the consequences that come from not using Quranic terms and concepts when we're referring to anti-Muslim discrimination. While it may have been a politically powerful concept for the development of Islamic subjectivities in the West, its application is politically short-sighted and reflects the colonization of Islamic knowledge, which I'll connect back to later. Islamophobia is limited in its ability to understand how Muslim-majority nation-states like Saudi promote an anti-Islamic type of religious tolerance that shifts the responsibility for social peace from the state to the citizen and distracts from its anti-Islamic policies. This helps reshape religious discourse in the name of the nation's interests. Saudi has powerful incentives to instrumentalize Islam by foregrounding religious interpretations that stifles Ummadic praxis and are paradigmatically opposed to Quranic teachings while actively secularizing Quranic concepts. The framework and racial paradigm of Islamophobia cannot fully account for this type of discrimination or secularization. Before delving in, I would like to quote from Dr. Latas when he said, "If even a few of such focus words were restricted in their meanings or were made to convey meanings which are not authentic and authoritative, by which I mean whose intentions no longer reflect those understood by authorities among the early Muslims, then this would inevitably create confusion and error in the minds of Muslims and disrupt intellectual and spiritual unity among them. Moreover, it would render sciences once considered praiseworthy to become blameworthy." Words are crucial in the understanding and obscuring of ideas. Failing to use Arabic words from the Quran to convey correct political meanings and realities implies an unawareness of the Islamic worldview. By naming and explaining anti-Islamic activities of Muslim-majority countries as Islamophobic, the meanings become attributed to a politically racialized and secularized paradigm rather within the Quran. Muslims become a people without the Quranic stories as a true historical account, and their futures are narrated and named by others, limiting the potential of Ummadic praxis. At the same time, non-translations allows for Muslim majority states like Saudi to capitalize on this gap and introduce redefinitions of Arabic terms from the Quran to serve their national interests. The case discussed will reflect Saudi's appointment of Mohammad Al-Isa, who is both known as the Zionist Imam and Imam al-Wasati. Saudi's usage of the Quranic term wasat, usually translated as tolerance, embodies a nationalized construction of tolerance despite its theologically contradicting implications. This reflects the urgent need to reintroduce correct applications of the Arabic language by studying the semantics of the Quran and projecting a worldview of it into political discourse. The phenomena of Muslims narrating and developing an Islamic political consciousness through a racialized paradigm remains a conscription of Western civilization and is an example of the enduring legacy of coloniality. Islamophobia cannot address how the subversion of Quranic meanings and commands are manifesting into political oppression. It can only locate Muslim oppression within other secular paradigms that can be easily manipulated and redefined to serve national interests in the name of Islam. To illustrate this, first, it's important to address coloniality's relation to secularism and religion. The notion of the modern concept of a religion was invented in early modern Western Europe and is primarily defined by the modern category of the secular and secular ideology, an ideology with many related practices that introduce distinctions between religion and politics. This was part of an imposed colonial strategy where spirituality was promoted as a permissible alternative to Islamic law for colonized subjects, which was categorized under the secular category of religion. This created the space to delineate the role of the Quran and Sunnah in the development of an Islamic political consciousness and affirmed secular fictions about ummatic challenges that are situated within myths of modernity. Dr. Dina Salame proposed that the myth of modernity is based on a coloniality trinity, where A, secularism is the rational and superior alternative to religion, B, the state is a secular nation with complete territorial sovereignty, and C, the law is univocal state law. In other words, secularism is an ideology that colonizes traditions by rendering them into religions, states by rendering them into nation states, and law by rendering it positive law. Within this trinity, coloniality sets the terms of conversation, and religion becomes what she calls a manifestation of coloniality, a universalizing mode of thought intertwined with colonialism. It's worth noting that before the modern period, there was no concept of religious or non-religious. Muslim identities were inevitably political. The political implications of Muslims not translating Quranic terms are that they are perceived as uniquely untranslatable because of their perceived sacred and essential characteristics. By not attempting to translate and contextualize Arabic ayats into academic and political dialogue, Muslims give meaning, explain, and interpret political developments through secular discourse, a discourse that can accommodate for Islamophobia, but not revelation. This not only maintains the intellectual colonization of the Ummah, but also perpetuates the privileging of Eurocentric systems of knowledge production. In the case of Saudi, this is especially problematic because non-translations creates a prime vacuum for the state to manipulate Islamic terminology to promote a version of Islam that is subservient to Saudi's political interests. Saudi is careful not to marginalize Islam completely while simultaneously repackaging and interpreting Quranic terms and concepts to legitimize national decisions. For example, the Zionist Imam Muhammad Isa is also known as the Wasati Imam, where the Quranic concept of wasat as tolerance is undermined and divorced of its Islamic meanings. To illustrate this, let us refer to Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 143, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. We have made you believers into a just community so that you may bear witness to the truth before others. Ibn Atiyah explained that the description of wasatan reflects that al-wasat is the best among everything. In this sense, the ummah deserves to assume the seat of testimony or shahada over others to relay the truth and clarify errors and distortions. Wasatan in its literal sense, the state of being in the middle, which implies having a balanced and just position away from extremism or indifference, stressing the importance of interfaith and dialogue between civilizations, yet the reference for such dialogue should be an Islamic wasatiyah based on the Quran and the Sunnah. The boundaries of wasatan are drawn by Allah and Islam, not by the state. However, Saudi tolerates its religious subjects if their public expressions of Islam reflect accepting Saudi's off-brand rebranding of it. Wasatiyya, or an Islamic tolerance, rejects extremism, but it does not lead to the melting of all religions under the framework of Abrahamic religions, tolerance, or moderation. Nor does it accept normalizing relations with Zionist oppressors because wasatiyya cannot be divorced from the Quranic concept of justice and balance, a justice that is incompatible with Saudi's idea of passive tolerance. Despite being labeled Imam al-Wasati, Muhammad Isa's dialogue and cooperation with anti-Muslim politicians and Zionists regularly focuses on building bridges and combating extremism while ignoring the role of such leaders in perpetuating structural oppression against its Muslim citizens. This clearly contradicts the balanced and just position of wasatiyya, as it is not wasati to take political positions that subjugates Muslims. By portraying Al-Isa as a wasati imam, Saudi also positioned forms of objection regarding his appointment as intolerant, extreme, and even un-Islamic. No differentiation was made between actual extremists and Muslims who approached justice and wasat from a Quranic standpoint who rejected his appointment. Islamophobia cannot encompass these Quranic incompatibilities or illuminate the ways the term wasatiyya is being co-opted to reflect Saudi's image of a tolerant and moderate Muslim. Furthermore, Saudi's normalization of Zionism by appointing Al-Isa shifts the expectation for social peace onto the citizen rather than the state. Saudi citizens are expected to accept its version of tolerance, a tolerance that accepts the violence of Zionism, while opposition are portrayed as intolerant Islamists disturbing social peace. In the case of Muhammad al-Isa, the waves of protests to remove the Wasati Imam from the pulpit was reported as the wrath of Islamists, a group of intolerant Muslims standing in the way of interfaith and intercultural dialogue. It becomes the citizen's responsibility to become more tolerant, which necessitates subverting the Quranic concept of tolerance in and of itself. This can lead to national identity construction being internalized as belief, which is especially paradoxical because of the incompatibilities of the nation state with both Sharia and Ummanic unity, topics which are beyond the scope of this paper, but very well worth engaging with and researching on. Quranic stories and terms possess a multitude of meanings that carry political and spiritual implications for Ummanic praxis. In fact, the Quranic term for stories, qasas, comes from the root qas, which signifies the following of traces. Political discourse, therefore, should be interpreted in a way that reflects trans-historical connections to the Quran that we're able to trace into the present. This both expands the horizons of Ummanic praxis and can simultaneously renew, clarify, and amplify already existing paradigms. For example, the Quranic concept of zulm as oppression both accounts for racialized forms of oppression and expands upon the connection between disobedience to Allah and political harm. Dr. Asim Qureshi, also just aside, I put this in my paper before I knew he was the moderator, so this was a very pleasant surprise, alhamdulillah. But Dr. Asim Qureshi expands on the notion of oppression in a virtue of disobedience when he says that it, quote, is not limited to a worldly understanding of rights being taken away from man, but also in terms of rights being taken away from Allah. In other words, disbelief. In that latter instance, another thing, person, or entity is put in the place of Allah's position. Thereby, it is us oppressing ourselves as we have subverted the spiritual relationship, end quote. All forms of oppression, including anti-Muslim racism, are therefore rooted in displacing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rights and acting in ways that validates socially constructed and baseless hierarchies of power that creates structured forms of zulm, or oppression. The point is not to criminalize language, but rather to better understand the limitations of Islamophobia, because it's being used to explain the presence, intensity, causes, and consequences of anti-Muslim sentiments independent of Quranic meanings and terms. As noted by Dr. Bowering, Western colonialism transformed the discursive terrain in which Muslim actors and discourses could advance their projects of reform. And in my humble opinion, Islamophobia is an example of that transformation. It manages the threshold of dissent on its terms, combating the challenges wrought by modernity through the language of modernity. Furthermore, Islamophobia conflates multiple Quranic categories of Islamophobes into a universalizing category that aren't differentiated under the framework of Islamophobia, although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala distinguishes and addresses the challenges posed by these actors categorically to the Ummah differently and commands varying responses. This prevents Muslims from developing diverse resistance or da'wah efforts tailored to each group accordingly and manages the horizon of Ummadic thought. Quranic discourse can reconfigure Islamic political consciousness and dismantle the logic of zulm and hierarchies of power at its root. Translating Quranic discourse semantically and contextually can amplify the kinds of interpretations needed to engender and empower Ummadic praxis, although it will necessitate precision and rigor to produce critical interpretations. In other words, decolonial translations through the Quran as the transcultural and transhistorical system of meaning can illuminate the ways Islamophobia reflects secular ideas about Ummadic political agency and can simultaneously foster Ummadic praxis based on the Quran and Sunnah. The development of Muslim political subjectivities through the framework of Islamophobia is a logical outcome given the enduring intellectual hegemony the Euro-American Academy exerts. Dr. Joseph Lombard notes that there's a prevailing tendency in Euro-American scholarship to declare interpretive frameworks that arise from within the Islamic tradition as invalid, end quote. This means that secular Eurocentric approaches to the Quran are preferred, while approaches rooted in bodies of knowledge that exist outside of the Euro-American context are not given authority and are deemed unintelligible. As a result, tafsir and the Quranic sciences are presented as uncritical pious readings. This form of epistemic colonization strips away the authority to interpret, contextualize, and apply Quranic learnings to understand political developments through a Quranic lens. Analytical authority is granted only to those whose approaches are seen as rational and civilized. Thus, Islamophobia becomes a rational and civilized way for Muslim academics to explain political hostilities through anti-Muslim racism, because its methodologies of analysis are accepted by the Academy. The Academy's superiority complex stifles Muslims' epistemic confidence to understand the Quran, both as a true historical account and as an epistemology to be interacted with to understand and better the human and Ummadic condition. Generating and expanding on the transcultural and transhistorical understandings in the Quran is impossible if the only intellectuals and methodologies or categorizations of analysis that are presented as valid are the ones that approach the Quran as non-divine. Decolonizing Islamic political consciousness necessitates recognizing the difference between decolonizing and de-Westernizing knowledge. Dr. Walter Mignolo notes that decolonizing knowledge, it alters the principles and assumptions of knowledge creation, transformation, and dissemination. De-Westernization, De-Westernization, by contrast, disputes the content of the conversation, not the terms. Islamophobia remains a symptom of deferring to an academic tradition that is rested upon a multitude of created instructions. And then my last point was just that when he was appointed, there was a wave of rejection and condemnation by many Muslims, and several scholars even, they produced a fiqh rule, like a fiqh ruling, saying why he shouldn't have been appointed, but the critique fell short. And so we need to illustrate how this appointment is anti-Islamic through a different approach. The ability of Saudi to be able to appoint a Zionist sympathizer like Mohammad Zakaria is a great demonstration of why Islamic governance is completely incompatible with the technology of governance known as the nation state. And in Saudi, Islamophobic practices would target and persecute Muslims that refuse to submit to its state version of Islam, those outside of the nation's constructed we. But this idea of submitting to the state instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would surely be better clarified with critical understandings and translations of shirk, for example. It's not just that conservative Muslim subjects are being regulated and disciplined through Islamophobic policies, but also that the meaning of submission as a Muslim is being redefined altogether. Thank you.
That was brilliant. I'm looking forward to the Q&A for that session in particular. I'm sure Dr. Simon's going to have a few questions and comments. No pressure. How are we looking with our online participants? Are they close to coming online? Otherwise, we'll get Asma to sing us some nasheeds in the interim. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, continue straight to the Q&A. Okay. All right. Yeah, we can start the Q&A. Dr. Fahid, please.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. Yeah, so again, thank you very much. Really excellent paper. Lots of food for thought. And I was just thinking about how this manifests differently in different places. So how Islamophobia manifests. So obviously I'm from the UK. So when we think about and talk about Islamophobia, we don't necessarily talk about it and understand it in the Islamic sort of framework that you outlined. And I certainly think that there is a place for that. And I think it's very appropriate to be talking about this in this conference where we're talking about Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries. But do you see any place for processes of racialization at all? Or are you talking specifically about Islamophobia in the Muslim part of the world? Because in Europe, for example, in the Western world, it's not that they dislike Islam for the sake of Islam. It's like there's been a sort of a development in the racism narratives and paradigms and discourses over the last 100 years, from we don't like you because you're black and what that signifies, criminality, backwardness, low IQ, and so on, to we don't like you because of your culture, values, religion, traditions, visions of the world, ways of life, and all the rest of it. And that includes Islam.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on that. Thank you very much.
So I think it's still definitely very useful to think of Islamophobia as a racialized governmentality, especially in the West and Europe. But I think there's still like this disconnect when we just think of it as a racialized governmentality, because like Dr. Austin illustrates in his book that racism at its root is still, it's a satanic act, right? So I think that my point is just that when we say Islamophobia, I think for a lot of Muslims, that's not being generated in their imagination. They're not actually thinking about like acting in a racist way as actually behaving in a way that is validating a hierarchy of power that basically like condemns shaitan, right? They actually are thinking about it in a very political, like Muslim identity kind of way. And I think this gap has to be bridged, because when you think of racism as a sin, right? Not just a sin, but also something that can manifest into, like you were explaining, so many different ways of actually subjugating Muslims and people of color and BIPOC, everything. It's a very different modality of moving through the world. I think when Islamophobia sometimes can secularize, even in the West, in my opinion, some of these connections.
Yes, always, please.
Thank you so much for that paper. It brought up some very crucial points of how the religious and the secular intertwine in very, very complicating and disturbing ways. So I really enjoyed your paper. I had one question about the idea of the state in your, let me say, decolonial critique. So one of the things that we notice is that the nation state, very complicated structure, was also the tool of decolonization. So for a lot of the countries that emerged out of imperial control, it was the nation state that allowed them to have some kind of nominal agency in the international order. So coupled with the fact that we have a very long state tradition in which the state participates with Muslims in adjudicating Islamic issues. So the state is never, in the Muslim mindset, a secular kind of entity. So how do we get past the tension between, number one, the nation state as we live in it today is a decolonial tool and something I think most people living outside of the West would not want to give up in any kind of serious way. And also with the fact that in our Muslim political imagination, the state plays a very direct role in adjudicating different Islamic problems. How do we square that with your decolonial critique?
Well, I mean, first I want to say that if something is when I say decolonial, I'm talking about implementing actually the paradigm of Sharia, right? So I'm not actually talking about decolonial. So for me, the nation state eviscerated any sort of potential for Ummadic praxis based on Sharia. I mean, this is better said by Wael Halak in The Impossible State. Ummadic's Institute is doing a lot of great work, kind of like elucidating these incompatibilities. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, actually, just to kind of further ask the question about, are we seeing in what's happening through Mohammad Isa and through UAE and Saudi and almost like a deification of the state?
Oh.
So, and is that the thing that's problematic here, as opposed to the state itself? Because throughout the history of the Ummah, we've always had statelets. There was always a degree of autonomy, especially from a fiqhi perspective. So like, alhamdulillah, one of the things about, Izzah Hussain, her book on the politics of Islamic rule really does a brilliant job of looking at the ossification of Islam as a formal legal structure. Prior to that period of colonization, where that takes place in Egypt, Malaysia, or Malaya and India, you have much more fluidity, right? So yes, you have states, kind of principalities maybe, but actually the law itself and its implementation is far more flexible. So what happens when you have large metropolises that require some degree of stability? So you need some form of state structure. How do we understand how we operate in an environment like that, where getting a mufti sitting under the tree to give you his advice becomes a little bit more difficult? I think that's the conundrum here. So I loved your presentation. I agree with everything that you say, but I also hear what Uwais is saying. There's a problem now between that and what you're saying in terms of how you actually manage the situation. And for me, where I see the problem is this idea that the state has taken the role of God within Muslim societies, and how do we then address that deification?
Wow, that was a big question. I mean, I just don't think the solution is in any sort of nation state model, right? I think maybe elucidating the incompatibilities with Sharia, and like even elucidating how Sharia has become positive law in the imagination of Muslims, even though that's not what it is really important. Also, I think the Ummah needs to come to terms with our nationalism problem, where that is becoming a form of shirk in a lot of ways, where people actually submit to what their nation's interests are at the expense of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. And this, I mean, you even see this in the Palestinian context, like the nationalism of Palestine, sometimes it trumps Sharia. And you know, also with Syria, with Assad, you see it time and time again. So it's actually that I think we, maybe because of all these reasons, but we're actually not really informed what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, what actually Shahada is in our day-to-day lives. But I also, I mean, I didn't get to this, but like there's actually no way to challenge Eurocentric historiography and learn the history of Muslim agency without centering Quranic terminology and the life of the Prophet ﷺ as the reference point. So long as we're just changing frames of reference without changing the reference point, I think we're just going to keep getting into cycles of, you know, whatever's come, like decolonial cycles, right? Instead of shifting completely to an Islamic paradigm.
So we can take one more question before we go on to Mohammad and Abdullah, and then I'll be able to give them 15 minutes and then a 10-minute Q&A too. So, Dr. Sami? Yeah. Oh, sorry. You got pipped to it. My apologies.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really
a good one because you talked about
I'll try my best. It was really enlightening. You were talking about how we always end up being at a disadvantage as Muslims trying to talk about our faith, especially in the modern context, because the only sources that are considered legitimate are secular sources. So those are the only sources considered rational. You mentioned that the only sources are considered legitimate are the ones that are not divine, as we believe. I was wondering what you think what the first step or what a good step would be to start to kind of change that norm, whether that starts within our community as Muslims or whether it starts with engaging in public conversations with people that are outside of the community to kind of challenge that. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first of all, I would say that it would have to be like a knowledge base. I think our knowledge base is really impacted by modernity, especially even the way we learn Islam and the way we project it then into the world. So I think it would start from the self, but I mean, I don't really know how, I mean, this is like anecdote is bad form, but I really think we don't have reverence for the Quran, like as something that can actually change your praxis, right? 3 years ago, you know, I was a Marxist living in Berlin, swearing I would never wear hijab again. And the Quran, you know, I read it in Arabic and in English, and that changed actually my entire paradigm. So, I mean, I think it's really important to educate ourselves, but I think it's also really important for each Muslim to really reflect on what is my intention in doing what I'm doing? Is it actually to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or am I trying to validate some sort of benefit that I want from a worldly perspective? And I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then opens up things and it trickles. But yeah, sorry if I didn't answer your question.
Not at all. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khair. Sorry, Dr. Sami, we've got to carry on. Yeah, I'm afraid. Sorry. Even if it's you, we don't. Oh, we've got until 6. Oh, sorry. All right, excellent. Go on, Dr. Sami.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Asma, for really very, very good and thoughtful and well-written paper. I just want to make a comment in the background, the alliance between the political and the religious class in the Arab world, particularly with regimes that claim to have legitimacy with Islam, like Saudi Arabia and others, it goes a long way. I mean, it's nothing new here. For decades, they were using the religious class. But I think what's happening, something that is probably new, which is after 9/11, there has been an element that was introduced in this relationship between tyrannical or despotic regimes and the religious class that are willing to bend all understanding and rules of Islam to satisfy and to please the political class, which is the foreign interference. We could see now that even within the framework of what happened after 9/11, sending people who would dictate what kind of educational things would be allowed, what kind of thing. We have seen it time and again. We've seen the particularly in the United States, you know, those, I'm not going to name names, but these religious figures who would go and visit the Holocaust memorials and do all sorts of things. And now we see it with the Abrahamic, and now we see it, you know, with your paper. The point I'm trying to make here is I would like to see more scholarship done on that relationship, and not just from a theological or even a cultural or religious point of view, but more of a geopolitical, and how that religious class is playing a very dangerous game, which is not only poisoning Muslim minds, but also making religion abhorrent, and religion being a source of, it's part of the colonialist mentality that is taking over. So I would like to see that in your paper a bit more, you know, that we can explore what this is about. There is a study that I think very important. I don't know if you've been exposed to it or not, that came in 2007. It's called Building Moderate Muslim Networks. Have you seen that one?
No.
All right. It's a very important study. It was given, I believe, by the security establishment in the United States. It was done by RAND, which is pretty close to them. It was done, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, just, okay. It was done by a historian, anthropologist, political scientist, and sociologist. It was led by Cheryl Bernard, who is the wife of Khalil Zad, who specializes in Islamic movements and Islamic revivals. And the gist of it is about 152 pages. It's just it reinterpreted and redefined what a moderate is. They put 15 conditions. And when you look at the 15 conditions, none of us would be a moderate. And they're trying to, and they're trying actually to penetrate into the influencers, particularly those who have religious backgrounds. So that comes pretty neat into what you're talking about. And then they talk in about 1 page on the model they would like to pursue. And they don't say anything about that model. So you really have to go and read a couple of other books to understand what they're talking about. So they're talking about what they call, we need to adopt the Congress for Cultural Freedom model, but they don't explain it. So you go back and try to find out what is it. And you find that in the literature, I mean, there are 2 really detailed books about it. It was a structure that existed, at least historically, between 51 and 79, but it was exposed in 66. And what it is, it's hundreds of organizations, of personalities, of journals, of clubs, of syndicates, of films throughout the world, Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, was all controlled and financed by the CIA out of Paris. And the guy who was actually in charge of it between 58 and 66, he gave his full testimony and full account in a book called Who Paid the Piper? The point I'm trying to make is that this comes out of also much bigger picture that I would like that to be added to the conversation. This is not just simply a one rogue imam who just suddenly became Zionist because, no, I think it's a much bigger thing. And I think we need to look at it from the standpoint of how they try, because that book is so dangerous in my view, you know, Building Moderate Muslim Networks, because it's trying to redefine what a Muslim is and redefine what a moderate is. They put 7 different categories of Muslims. They say we're never going to get the atheist. That's not going to happen with Muslims. If we get the secularist, would be great, but that's also maybe would be very, very, you know, little. But we can get the moderate. But let's redefine what a moderate is. So when you talk about wasati, that's what they mean by the moderate. Moderate, if you accept Israel, okay. If you don't accept Israel, you're not a moderate. If you accept Quran literally, that this literally came from God, you're not a moderate. You have to be like the Christian who thinks, okay, the general meaning may be from God, but not literal. If you believe in Sharia to be part of people, you're not a moderate. So they're trying to push that. I think that's that's the whole thing. And I think it's a very good paper, but we need probably to expand a bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. No, I mean, that's a lot of food for thought. I'm looking forward to reading that, inshallah.
It's online free.
Amazing.
Yeah, Cheryl Bernard's paper is very, very important. You know, it's, I think, the first time that Hamza Yusuf mentioned explicitly as somebody that they saw as the ideal Muslim for the West. I mean, that's not his fault that he gets mentioned, I should just add, right? Like whatever problems we have with him in terms of some of his political posturing, but they saw him that way. They saw him as the ideal person that they could try and co-opt and, you know, kind of model the ideal Muslim on. It's called civic democratic Islam or civil democratic Islam. No, that's a different one. Oh, that's right. So there's two actually that she writes. One's called Building Moderate Networks and Civil Democratic Islam. I think she mentions Hamza Yusuf in Civil Democratic Islam. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll get into the session with Mohammed and Abdullah, and then no, they're not available. Oh no, they dropped again. All right, so Asma and I are going to start singing nasheeds. No, but in all seriousness, if we can carry on the conversation a little bit, I think that would be great. Anyways, I'll come to you in a second. Coming back to your paper, and even bringing in, without mentioning who earlier, some of the discussions around Bangladesh and some of the, you know, these post-colonial countries that exist, right? Because the way when I hear what you're saying about the post-colonial moment, and especially in Africa, you read the works of Walter Rodney, you know, you read the works of Fanon and others, right? This is a moment for all of these new emerging states to come through. I think one of the problems that I've had with that is the way in which these states emerge. So yes, they emerge, but what happens is that often, in my reading of the history, at least anyway, is that they ended up replicating a black or brown version of the same colonial elites that existed before. So the question of whether or not decolonization ever took place, I think is still up for question. But also from the perspective of the financial regime that was ubiquitous amongst all of these countries. So they go immediately into a state of debt that is a form of slavery. So when we say the word decolonization, what is it that we actually mean? Or post-colonial, what is it we actually mean? Because what you have is by name a new post-colonial state, but in infrastructure, something that's still entirely colonial. There are very, very few instances, I think we could argue, of where there is real systemic change that comes immediately. I would even argue that the Islamic Revolution in Iran was limited by a system of kind of financial crippling that existed in the world at that time. Like there's only so much you can possibly do when you are so constricted. So the question back to you is, right, is, was there ever a real post-colonial moment? Because I would argue that there never was, that we've never seen that all we've had is a continuity of colonialities into the present moment. But I'm very much willing to be corrected by anyone who has another view on that, and even yourself.
We have some countries experiencing get out, but still, of course, they are manipulated by the word quality. In case
Cuba, I mean,
Could I
go ahead, Oais. Sorry, and then
a,
Mubashir, I'll come to you straight after.
I just want to make a quick comment, is that I think I think historical context is really empowering, and when we think through these issues, the fact that the Muslim Ummah has been divided into small states, from one perspective, seems as a mode of disempowerment. But on the flip side, it could be seen as a strategy of managing weakness, in this sense that a Muslim polity may not be able to defend a large territory. However, with the right will, it has been demonstrated that we can defend a certain limited amount of territory. So the case of Afghanistan, although the Taliban is not an ideal situation, but it demonstrates that no matter what the empire tries to impose, that there is limits to the amount of territorial acquisition that they can amount to. This example is not just to Afghanistan present day, but I feel like, for instance, Çanakkale in Turkish history is also of a similar moment where Ottoman elites realized that, okay, well, we cannot defend, right, far off lands. We don't have the economic and political ability to do that. However, we can defend a certain limited territory, and there is limits to occupational powers. So that's number one. And number two is that, I mean, we just had a huge earthquake in Turkey, and there are, I think there would be no Turkish citizen would want to have lived in a situation where the government, especially the state, the modern state, was not there to help relief. I mean, this is something that, you know, a transnational imagination, you know, when we think about a transnational imagination or some large ummatic kind of imagination, which has its advantages, but there are some real problems that only the state can solve. So I would take real caution in advocating a kind of anti-nation state narrative on our liberation, because I do think we don't have a system that is post-colonial in the sense that we have a liberated system, but we do have moments. So, you know, when we think about the Indonesian Revolution, when we think about the formation of Pakistan, when we think about the formation of Iran after the Constitutional Revolution, we think about the formation of Turkey, you know, there are moments that are deeply anti-colonial in our own tradition. And I don't think it's to chalk that up to some secular victory does enough for the fluidity in those moments, because no one knew at that time. For instance, when the Turkish Revolution happened, no one predicted that there would be this like secular Kemalist regime that would take over. That's not why people died, you know, and nor was it in Pakistan that we would have this military like junta that would just take over the country. This was not part of our imagination, but definitely everybody was down for a modern state and modern nation state. And that is ingrained in our anti-colonial Muslim history. So I don't really, even now in Palestine, I mean, we're advocating for a nation state in Palestine. So, I mean, that is the argument. We're trying to find a liberating mode of anti-colonial Muslim nationalism.
We have Zakaria with us. And so we are going to try and do the, just to say, Owais, thank you so much for that contribution. I don't want to turn it into a tit for tat. So, but it is a conversation that I definitely want to continue with you, inshallah. So we do have the final presentation. So it'd be wonderful to hear from Mohammad Zakaria. He is currently pursuing a doctorate of philosophy and law from the International Islamic University in Malaysia. And this is a joint paper with Abdullah Al-Masood. And the title of their paper is Atomized Scholarship, Authoritarian Regimes, Subjective Islam, and Future of the Ummah, a Siyasa Shari'iyya study. Brother Mohammad Zakaria, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. We're receiving some feedback on your end.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Hello, could you hear me, please?
We can hear you, but there's quite a lot of noise in the background that we're picking up. Sounds like an auntie's telling her child off.
In fact, I just emailed to you the conference organizers. I was actually on the move to attend a program. As you know, we actually have a lot of programs, tafsir al-mahfil programs that begin in Bangladesh winter season, that begin mid-November all the way to April maybe. So there's a pre-scheduled program for me. So I just emailed to you, is it possible for you to reschedule my turn for tomorrow evening or not? So because I am already in that program to attend the tafsir lecture on this very rural area. Is it possible? Because here huge noise here. I'm prepared, by the way, slides and inshallah other issues, but the situation here is not that friendly for us to present. So is it possible for me to have with you tomorrow the paper?
Jazakallah khair. Unfortunately, I think the program's very full tomorrow, and it'd be difficult to carve that time. Could you give us maybe something like a 10-minute summary?
Okay, please.
Of
please,
your
Jazakallah khairan. Okay,
Barakallah feek.
Jazakallah khairan. And once again, I'm really sorry for the noise here. Allah, I'm really sorry.
No problem
And
at all.
I humbly apologize for this noise. Jazakallah khairan.
We can hear you fine though. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Jazakallah khairan. In fact, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu was-salamu ala Sayyid al-Anbiya'i wa ashraf al-mursaleen amma ba'd. وقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد. I oftentimes begin by reciting from Quran, and by the way, it's quite relevant. The verse I'm going to recite, not the verse, a portion of the verse. منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله. I might be quite randomly presenting and quoting from the paper. In fact, by quoting this verse, Shatibi alayhi rahma tries to locate the Kharijite attitude, their efforts into three different characteristics. And he says, by importing their understanding of inil hukmu illa lillah, in fact, they tried to segregate, isolate all other related issues from the fact of inil hukmu illa lillah. So they have three different criteria in their effort to respond or to react to the decision of Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So I'll focus on that a little bit after having some words on my title. Atomized scholarship, as you know, atomization is a kind of antonym to the holisticism. Or atomization is a kind of disciplinarization of knowledge. So, and then authoritarian regime, subjective Islam, and future of the Ummah, a Siyasa Sharia study. In fact, I was trying to examine the atomization of knowledge based on the directives of Siyasa Sharia, based on the directive of Siyasa Sharia, and from my, I'm yet to finish, and because I am still working on my dissertation, a PhD dissertation. So far, we could come up with the idea that Siyasa Sharia is not only that as we translate, but as we understand, is a kind of political thought in Islam, rather it is beyond. And political thought in Islam is a small aspect of overarching dimension of Siyasa Sharia so far. So Siyasa Sharia is a distinctive civilizational indicator and also onto epistemic expression of Islam, and then juristic political science. And this last part actually so far we could translate frequently as the political thought in Islam. So, and from there actually begins so many inconsistencies sometimes. And the issue actually I was trying to address in my paper is there is frequently quoted fatwa from different from some contemporaries or some contemporary ulama who says if you go against the decision of a certain government, Muslim government, in fact, it is something that doesn't lie in line with the principles of Sharia that is discussed in the fiqh manuals. Because we had huge issues back in the history, in Islamic history, the mas'alatul khuruj, or the problem of revolting against the state, against the government. So in the present time, in the Muslim world, we have ulama across the Muslim world. We have certain ulama who actually make us understand that if we go against any decision of certain government, it amounts to a kind of revolting against the, or at least it may lead to revolt against certain Muslim government. So by claiming this way, arguing this way, they are saying it's a kind of khuruj, mas'alatul khuruj. It fall under the category of mas'alatul khuruj. That's why we shouldn't go against the government, because it's a kind of haram activities. And I was actually trying to explore the real fact of this issue. So when we go back into the history and we evaluate the situation, conditions, and contingencies in the light of siyasa shar'iyya, we came up with different set of different aspect of the fatwa. For instance, if we go back to the time of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah is quite clear. And because when there's a Nafs Zakiya, as he's renowned or famous in that name, actually is Muhammad bin Abdullah. Yes, Muhammad bin Abdullah was another brother. He's another brother of Ibrahim bin Abdullah. These two brothers also went against the decision and they actually revolted against the rule of Abu Ja'far Mansur. And before that, also Zaid bin Ali also revolted against the rule of Abu Ja'far Mansur. And all these three persons got assistance from Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, either intellectually or some sort of financial support. And then subsequently, a man by the name of Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath, who also revolted against Umayyad rule. Then Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla, Sa'id bin Jubair, Nabul Bakhtari, all those renowned giant fuqaha, they sided with this person. So in fact, there are issues, or we may say the way some contemporaries quoted the fatwa is a kind of in isolation. So by quoting this way, actually they are paving for the authority regimes to explore and exploit these facilities. And by quoting all those authoritarian regimes, by quoting this isolated fatwa, they are trying to justify their oppression, their exploitation of the rights of the citizens. So actually, I was trying to in the whole paper from a very theoretical perspective. So just let me summarize in a few words. In fact, the challenges or issues or problems suffocating the ummah, either in the Western Hemisphere or Muslim world, is spring from certain intellectual lacuna that we are rife with. And just let me quote from Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah says, مثار التخبط ينتج في الفروع عن التخبط في الأصول. When you don't have the clearest access to the principles, then this obscure access to principles may mislead you, and by so misleading, you may fall in some divine space. So when these people are this ulama, contemporary ulama, who says that we shouldn't go against the state, so actually by referring this way, they are advocating the justification of authoritarian regimes, oppression, and their exploitation, state violation. This is one issue. Another one issue, if we look at the in American Declaration of Independence, we may see another type of government system, that is democratic government system, in which the American Declaration of Independence clearly says there are certain values and ethos that democracy upholds. So when certain governments undermines those values, then people have all the right to revolt against that government and to change their government system so that they have their rights to be realized. So in this point, I mentioned in my title, automized scholarship and then authoritarian regime subject to Islam. In fact, when we are automizing our scholarship, it means we are isolating our understanding of Islam from all other relevant channels of scholarship within Islam. And by doing so, we are replicating some sort of Kharijite understanding of Islam. And ultimately, we are giving the premise to the authoritarian regimes to continue their power. And also, when we are using Islamic scholarship in an isolation, we are inviting or incubating a kind of extremism in those group of Muslim citizens who are not aligned with this sort of understandings. And all together, the authoritarian regimes using either in the name of terrorism or in the name of facilitating fatwa given by some contemporaries. So finally, my humble observation was that for us to get our right realized, in fact, we have to understand Islam from a holistic perspective. And also for us to get the due remedy for the Ummah, or for the rest, with a view to restoring the Ummatic interest to its proper locus, we have to have first and foremost determine the proper locus and host of knowledge. And by doing so, we would be able to treat certain intellectual mechanisms and products properly, and eventually that proper use of intellectual arena and intellectual products and tools may allow us to treat the issues and challenges in a befitting way that is the demand of the time. And this is actually, I'm really sorry because I was just moving on a very rural area to attend the tafsir program. I was not that ready. However, my slides are ready. I just briefly I'm quoting from my memory, so it is not that well arranged.
No,
I'm really sorry for that.
Jazakallah khair. That was a really excellent summary, and I'm actually really looking forward to reading the full paper. So I hope we can get a hold of that soon. I think that there's definitely a lot of scholarship that you're working on, especially from within the tradition of Islam itself, that I think is extremely important for all of us to think about and reflect on. I think it might be a bit difficult to do a Q&A, but I'm happy to try. It's up to you. Are you willing to take some questions, or is it a bit difficult?
Actually, maybe one question we may take, because I am just on the brink of time is very short for me. Just
no problem. No problem. Well, we don't want to make.
At least we may take one question, by the way, inshallah, so that for me.
Okay. We can. We've got one question from Dr. Sami, if you don't mind answering that. Dr. Sami's asking, could you give your impressions on the similarities and differences between kind of contemporary madkhali thought, so kind of like a Saudi kind of Salafism, with the way that authoritarian scholarship was used more classically? Is there a difference or a similarity between these two different types of kind of scholarly output, should we say.
I am quite interested in looking into these issues. I'm quite interested in looking into these issues, by the way. And I am a quite fan of, you may say, Imam Shatibi alayhi rahmah, whose magnum opus creation al-i'tisam, and anyone wants to evaluate his scholarship or the affairs inside outside Muslim world, then I think one should study this wonderful creation of Imam Shatibi alayhi rahmah al-i'tisam. Yeah, we do focus on al-muwafaqat, of course, also masterpiece, but for us to understand all those issues, I think we have to refer ourselves to this i'tisam, by the way. So, and regarding the question, in fact, we always try to address the issue from a very theoretical and, of course, pragmatic aspect of scholarship. So I don't have that much access to the Madkhalis or the Saudi Arabia's contemporary policies regarding the government and the civic rights of their citizens, but I do understand the very foundational principles. And once you have the principles internalized quite well, then this internalization leads you to differentiate or to similarize between Madkhalis or the Saudi regimes, the way they are governing their people. So you may say it's kind of Kharijite activities are on the table, in fact, and I shouldn't name any state specifically, but yes, there are activities, there are state decisions that are replicating the Kharijite attitude, and by replicating so, they are justifying their decisions, no matter this decision is quite violative, quite quite anti-citizen interests. So I shouldn't go further anymore. So there are issues actually, and so is the issue in this part of Muslim world, by the way, where by sitting where I'm addressing you, this meticulous audience. So there are issues, and I was trying to address all those issues here. Jazakallahu khairan.
Jazakallah khair. We really appreciate your time. Hayakallah.
Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we still have about just under 25 minutes before we close the session. So I think this opens up an opportunity for us to have some serious discussion. Before I come to you, I just want to make one point here about what we were just discussing. It seems to me that some of the Aqidah wars of the 90s, for those of us who are old enough to remember the 90s, they were traditionally between kind of like Salafi thinking and certain types of Sufi thinking. So basically people split themselves across these lines. States took one view or another. What I've found in recent years in particular, I'm going to say this is probably like the last 8-9 years, is that the opinion of the Madkhalis has aligned very, very closely with neo-traditionalism. So, you know, these type of actors who were traditionally against one another, loggerheads with one another, are now actually swimming in the same stream, which, you know, when we were talking earlier about the deification of the state, right, it is to maintain the hegemony of the state at all costs. And I find that so fascinating because these guys were ideological enemies for so long. And, you know, I lived through, you know, reading and watching these debates take place live. And so for me to see now that they are literally in the same project with one another, it's a very fascinating moment. So I want to open that up to if anybody wants to kind of discuss that a bit further. But sorry, brother, you had your hand up for a while, so I want to hear from you too. Yes, you please. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to meet everybody yet. So if you could please just say your name, I'd personally, I'd appreciate it.
speaking. In fact, the argument is based and founded on a very simplification of the problem, you know. This is the main point that I want to raise here, that the question is whether the people has the right to protest against an unjust government or no. This is the question. And it's a simplification of the problem. Today's the challenges that we face are not so simple. It's very complicated. What is the scale and extent of that unjust government? And what is the method to face and confront such a government? John Rawls, for example, discussed the civil disobedience, or if we did not recognize the government is completely unlegitimate, then the people have the right to make protests against the government, and this protest to what extent? For example, during the third caliph, we have some companions, some people revolted against the third caliph, and this revolt reached to the death of the caliph, the third caliph. During the fourth caliph, we have the same. We have so many wars, civil wars, in the caliphate. During the reign of Yazid, Imam Hussein revolted against Yazid, but at the same time, we have during, for example, Zayd revolted, and on the other side, Imam Sadiq, the Ja'fari Mazhab, they are followers of Imam Sadiq. He refused to revolt against such government. Therefore, it is not so simple. That yes, the question is whether we have the right to make a revolution against the government or no. The society is so much complicated, and we should examine case by case. And this has been discussed even in jurisprudence. Therefore, this paper is founded, I believe, in very simplification of the question, and the problem is not so simple. Thank you.
There's a very good book by Osama Al-Azmi called Islam and the Arab Revolutions, where he goes through the debates between neo-traditionalist scholars like Habib Ali Jifri and Abdullah bin Bayah against the arguments that Yusuf al-Qardawi was making exactly on these very points. There's another book by a Malaysian scholar whose name I've forgotten now, called On Civil Disobedience in Islam, which is very good on this subject as well, and he goes through the debates and discussions.
Sorry, one more sentence, please, two, maybe 10 seconds.
Sure.
Professor Heba Rauf Ezzat, it's a professor of Cairo University. He has she wrote a very good work, الخيال الإسلاميين ما قبل الدولة وما بعدها. She says that I entered this movement when I was a young student in the university, and finally at present, she says, شبت معه ومنه, because the situation is different. We have to study case by case. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Would anybody like to respond? Asma? No? Yeah, would you like to say anything? Yeah, of course. We love an of course.
I think it's very true that these issues are complicated, very complex, and you can't take one approach, because at the end, most scholars would talk about the lesser of two evils. Which one would devastate the Muslim society more? So at certain point, and I think even Osama al-Azam, he makes that point, is that when it comes to the issue of revolution against despotic regimes, oppressive regimes, tyrannical regimes, what would be the criteria by which we can say that this is a legitimate khuruj? Because most Sunni scholars would say that if the result of the khuruj, of revolting against an existing regime, is going to end up by having a more costly endeavor by which more Muslims would die, more chaos, more disruption, more fitna, then it's better that that's the traditional position. The Shia has a different version, of course, because Imam Hussein maybe has against odds, but he decided to go because he thought that this was enough and he thought it's going to be successful. So I think now in modern times also, we need to look at not just the simple versions that we have from history. I think there's a bigger picture also at play here. Is because if Islam will always be thought as an ideology or as a religion that will only justify tyranny and oppression because this is better than what the outcome would be, I think most people may end up saying, Islam doesn't do any good for us. So I think it has to be very carefully studied in terms of scholarship, not just from a religious point of view or historical point of view or a fatwa kind, because now revolutions have become a science. Revolutions succeed and fail not just because of an ideology. It has a lot of factors involved in it. So we, as Islamic scholarship or as a scholarship, we need to study why revolutions succeed, why they fail. And when the probability of success is much more than the probability of failure, then it becomes incumbent upon those who are capable of making it successful that they involve themselves in it. For example, the ideology of Islam doesn't change. Circumstances do. There are, in my study, I found that there are necessary conditions or necessary factors. There are local factors, and there are structural factors for the success of revolutions. Most people look at one or two factors and they decide whether this is not enough. What I'm trying to say here, I don't want to take too much time, is that Islam does have a position towards tyranny and the issues of justice, but it also looks at the aftermath. By which, is it going to be better for society, or do you have to wait? Okay, it's not a matter of always accepting tyranny because he allows people to pray. That's ridiculous in my view. It's about what the society would come after that revolution. So we have to satisfy all the factors, all the conditions, and then put your trust in Allah. But if you lack the basic factors, the basic conditions for success, it's not enough to have a good intention.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that. Something to put back to all of you, I guess, then is, kind of riffing off Asma's request that we center the Quran more in our thinking. When we talk about cost-benefit analysis, when we talk about success, what are we basing that on? Because when we think about material success, actually, in relation to the stories of tyranny in the Quran, there's very little that we are given in terms of examples of material success. Normally, everybody dies, is tortured to death, is killed, is burnt alive. And those are the ones who are described. You know, the magicians of Pharaoh have only been Muslim for about 20 minutes before they're crucified by their opposite hand and leg. They're the successful ones. So, in fact, the schema presented in the Quran for success looks like material failure as far as things are concerned. So where do we then get this notion that a cost-benefit analysis in our presentation to the general public is based on what the end result will look like from a material perspective? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying for a second that we shouldn't be sensible or strategic or plan. What I'm talking about is the ultimate ethic that exists inside our hearts and the one that we present. Could it, for example, look like a complete victory if Islam is wiped out of the UK, but every single last Muslim says that I'm never going to give up on the Salah, I'm never going to give up on the Zakah, I'm never going to give up on my hijab, I'm never going to shave off my beard? This is just an extreme example. But what is success? Is success like the fatwa of Orhan, where we're scared to make wudu, we're plunging into a swimming pool to make wudu, like they did in Andalusia? Is that success, that maybe we carry on Islam for another 70, 80 years, but we're being force-fed pork? As we know, Marine Le Pen was already requesting in relation to France. So, I mean, we can study Spain and say, well, that's far off in history, but then we hear the echoes of that. You know, in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella would write letters to their priests saying that this al-malfa, which is what they called the niqab during the Inquisition, is a barrier to integration. The words were almost exactly a replica of what they've been using in Europe. So it's not like that history is so far removed from contemporary discourse. But what I'm saying is, when we're constantly thinking about pragmatism, ideas around pragmatism and ideas around success, what are we talking about? Because, you know, for me, the fundamental point is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already promised that this deen is protected. So when we're talking about pragmatism, we're not responsible for protecting this deen, right? So where does this now fit in? The pragmatism versus the Quranic ethic? Because I think that's something that I struggle with all the time. And, you know, I get, from my own sheikh, I get accused of idealism a lot. He doesn't like the fact that I'm always, you know, virtue of disobedience. I'm even disobedient, even disobedient to my own sheikh, right? But, you know, this is something I still struggle with him and with many other scholars in particular. It's something that Osama al-Azmi and I argue about a lot. He takes a more pragmatic approach. I'm like, you know, throw caution to the wind, you know, and Bismillah. So I think we're gonna pretty much close the session a little bit early, unless somebody would like to make some kind of last interjection. All right, no. In that case, alhamdulillah, class dismissed early today. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khair to all the speakers. MashaAllah.